Although my family had long assumed that we had no living relations across the sea, that some of the relatives had most likely been part of a murder in a ravine called Baba Yar in September of 1941, and the various other branches had met their ends in equally grim manners, almost 40 years after the end of World War II, we welcomed this tough, colorful Israeli with an uncanny resemblance to our Russian grandfather, as well as his family, into our small, now totally Americanized tribe. Despite obliterating our extended family, Hitler had failed to erase us completely because, against so many odds, one link in our family had managed to survive, and by going to the trouble of coming to New York and making an exhaustive search to find my aunt, Cousin V had reconnected himself to our slim chain and we to his. So in other words, fate had decided otherwise, and the past hadn't really been obliterated for my family. As it turned out, fate made me a writer. It made me a gatherer of stories from this ghastly time. In fact, I became like someone who I was eventually going to write about, who had also wanted to put their past behind them. And I'm going to read you a piece about this woman. This was a woman doctor, and this goes back to the question, should we remember the past or should we bury it? This woman was a doctor in Poland. She was a pediatrician, and she worked with sick, starving, and diseased children. Her name was Adina Blady Schwarzker. Okay. Having put her wartime memory away, Adina decided never to write or speak about these times. And she never did. She explains her thinking. If I remained silent, I'd manage to forget at least some of it and be able to live like everybody else. Years were passing. I didn't manage to forget, but I still believed that I had the right to remain silent. She stuck to her vow. Slowly, the bombed-out ruin of Poland was cleared, and rebuilding began. The sound of hammering could be heard. The smell of fresh paint permeated the air. Trolleys again ran through the streets. Damaged historic buildings underwent the long process of restoration, or were completely brought down. Rubble was cleared. Street lamps were replaced, and the streets were lit at night after years of darkness. Eventually, one could find toothbrushes and even sour cream in the shops. To be able to add a bit of sour cream to beet soup or to the top of a potato pancake was an exquisite joy. Life, days, then years, then decades, took on a peaceful cadence. Her work as a doctor continued. She says, being a doctor sets you apart from normal life. It means that you always have to think of other people's pain as though it is something more important than your own. Work, the hospital, her home life also became a kind of parapet that set the world apart. 43 years, a lifetime passed. At age 71, Adina became ill. She was taken to the hospital and put into a ward where she hovered between life and death. She was tired of life, and she had no fear of death. Although her body was racked by illness, the thread of physical life continued to hold her to the world. For a long time, lying in the ward, she was neither dead nor alive. During this nether time, the memories she'd tried to kill hovered. Suddenly, she felt that she was in the presence of the past. Against her will, recollection and memory stirred. The image on a yellowed board that she'd painted in childhood came back to her. It was of her child's room, of a potted amaryllis standing on a windowsill. She remembered the view of rooftops that could be seen through her childhood window. The painting was one of the only remnants she'd been able to preserve from the past. She called the painting a fragment of a dead world. She remembered how she stood in a throng of people watching the conquering German army march through Krakow, seeing the eyes of the conquerors, who seemed to be made of ice. She remembers the taste of the half-pound of Pluto's chocolate she and her mother frivolously bought that day with the last of their money. She recalled the presence of fear that had to be hidden. Quote, "But it was there, coiled up tight like a spring in your stomach. It would sometimes wake and send a piercing, icy shiver through your whole body. Images, fragments, scenes, gruesome memories of the past returned. They were unstoppable." Weak as she was, lying in the hospital ward, dying in fact, and not frightened, Adina resisted the onslaught of memories. But finally, she couldn't stop them any longer. They seeped into her mind. They steeped themselves into the waking, sleeping, unconscious atmosphere. Finally, the poisonous snake of memory bit through her strong will and released its venom. Quote, she said, "Another fear overcame me, that I wouldn't make it in time, that I wouldn't repay the debt I owed to those times." Closed quote. Suddenly, Adina feared that she would die without bearing witness to what she had seen, that her knowledge of the past would die with her. She called for a pen, for paper. Quote, she said, "And I started to hurry. There on a hospital bed, I started to write quickly to win the race against time. Using the venomous memory of ink, though very late in life, she wrote a memoir that she titled I Remember Nothing More, which she was able to complete and see published in 1988. Although infirm, aged, and not long for the world, she built a monument to memory using words as mortar." Anyway, I identified with this woman when I finally discovered her, because suddenly I had become this sort of person. Even though it was a time in history that I hadn't witnessed. But as a writer, actually before I began writing on this subject matter, I would write about anything. And I had a nose for a good story. And I was not particularly interested in that past time in history at first. But like most of you, I knew this face. Do you all know this face? How many people know this face? Okay. I also knew this face. I didn't know that much more about the life around this face, but when I was a teenager, like most of you, I had read Anne Frank's diary. I'd read it, I'd forgotten it. But again, fate interceded, because in my late 30s, I was in Hollywood working on a television show, and I met, of all people, a priest who had known Anne Frank's father. Anne Frank's father, who was the only one of the group that had hidden, was the only one who survived. But he was now dead. He died in 1980, and this was 1984 or so. But this priest told me about two people who were still alive, the last remaining people who Anne had written about in her diary, and that they were still alive. And as a writer, sensitive to story, I realized that the people that this guy was talking about were the last surviving members of a whole sort of epic that all of us, I mean, the whole world knows about Anne Frank. But these two people who were now old, the couple, Miep and Jan Gies, she was in her late 70s, he was in his 80s, had never told their side of the story.